girls, it's Mick, and today I wanted to show you the whole process of my first Inktober drawing, which is the hibiscus tea witch. If you follow me on Instagram, you can find the link down below. You will have seen the poll for this one, and there will be more coming up in the future for the rest of my Inktober videos. So I wanted to show you the process from start to finish, and there are a couple of things in this video that actually didn't really go to plan, but I figured I would show it anyway because when does anything ever really go to plan? When I started this digital sketch, I thought that what I was going to do was that I was going to create the digital sketch and then I was going to have it printed. I actually don't have a working printer, so I was going to get it printed at my local Officeworks, which, if you're not in Australia, is basically just an office supply store, and they do printing of documents and things like that. And then I was going to use a light box to trace it onto traditional watercolour paper so that I could paint it traditionally with watercolour. But as it turned out, my partner had to get knee surgery recently, so we had to isolate in the time that I was trying to create this video, and that meant that I couldn't go and pick up the print that I had organised to have printed. So anyway, throughout this whole process I was thinking I should refine things and make things perfect rather than just making this like a concept sketch so that I could figure out all the elements of the piece and where everything would go. And the reason that I do it digitally first is because I do find that it's easier to figure out the concept and get all the different elements in the right places without having to really destroy the paper, because I end up erasing a lot and I don't like doing a whole bunch of sketches first. I guess that would probably be more helpful, but I don't usually have a whole lot of ideas. I just have like this one idea and I have it in my head and I don't want to play around with it and do different things. And if I do sketches in my sketchbook, I usually find that the first sketch that I do is the one that I want to use for my final piece, and I usually can't recreate it again as well as I did the first time, which doesn't really make sense because, you know, practice makes perfect or whatever. But basically I can't recreate the sketch again, so I like to just do my first sketch and stick with it. And I've found that when I do that first sketch digitally, I end up with a better piece because I do have a lot more options when it comes to redoing things and not having to erase things, and I'm able to move things around digitally, like you have seen a couple of times. But I was able to elongate her body and give her a neck, because when I initially sketched out all the insides, the skeletons, I didn't really put them in the right spots, and that happens to me sometimes because I don't know, I guess I'm just not an expert. But you'll see a few times throughout this video that I do need to move things around and change the positions of stuff and enlarge stuff. I think that that's much easier to do digitally, and while digital art is not the easy, simple process that some people think it is, like I've seen a couple of videos on YouTube where people will like make the title "What People Think Digital Art Is," and then they just kind of swipe their Apple Pencil over the iPad and then art appears, and that's just not the case. And I think a lot of people think that sometimes that is the case. So I wanted to show you what the process like kind of is, and it's still very traditional and still requires you to try and practice and work hard and use references and things like that. So I struggled a lot with her skirt in this one, and so I redid it a few times until I finally came up with something that I liked, and I stuck with it. There were certain times where I thought I was just going to give her leggings because that's easier. Clothing is something that I've always struggled with drawing, so it's just an ongoing process, and this time I just sort of forced myself to get something else other than like either nudity or skin tight clothes. And I probably could have been helped by using a reference, which you may have noticed if you watch my channel over the course of it. I've mentioned a few times that I just need to use more references. The final touch here, I think, is me just adding a leaf over her foot, because I decided, you know what, I have struggled with these hands and I have no idea what they're going to be doing in the final illustration, and I've already drawn another foot, so I don't want to draw a second foot. And I used a very well-known artist trick called using other parts of the drawing to hide the bits that you don't want to draw. It's like when you can't draw two of the same eyes and you just cover one of them with hair. Anyway, that was the end of the digital sketch. I did refine it quite a bit because I really thought that I was going to be using it as something to trace, but like I said, wasn't able to go and pick up the print, so I ended up just sketching my piece out traditionally while using the iPad as a reference in itself. So really what that digital sketch ended up being was a guideline for my composition, because I did end up moving things around quite a lot, and by doing that first sketch digitally it really helped me to figure out where I wanted all the elements to be and how I wanted the composition to look and how I could place everything effectively so that it all looked right. The prompt was hibiscus tea witch. So as soon as I heard hibiscus tea witch, I didn't want to just like draw a witch drinking hibiscus tea. I wanted to incorporate it a little bit more into the design. So that's what I did, and here she is sitting on a hibiscus flower. And honestly, I said a lot of what I wanted to say about the sketch in the digital sketching process, so I guess I don't really have much to talk about while I sketch her here traditionally, except for the fact that I guess like I did my best not to erase too much so that I wouldn't ruin the paper when it came to painting, because erasing on watercolor paper can sometimes damage the paper to an extent that when you do go and start to paint, it can make the washes uneven because some of the paper is damaged, some of it isn't, and that makes the paint look different in different places. So I did my best to follow my reference very closely, and this is the result. So I guess for the rest of the sketch, I will just leave you alone to watch the time lapse while you listen to this spooky music that I found that I'm always struggling with music choices. Like I never know if it's too much or too little or whatever, it doesn't matter. Sorry, I'll go away now. The inking process, which is like the whole Inktober thing, and that's the reason that I decided to go in with this piece and use a black fine liner when I normally wouldn't. Usually my process is to go through and watercolor something, and then once the watercolor washes are laid down, I will go over with a more concentrated form of the watercolor and use that to create a kind of line art. But I usually don't go in with a black fine liner because I usually find it a little bit too harsh, but after doing this piece, I think that I might stick with it. Obviously I was going to stick with it through the month of October anyway, but I really enjoyed it. I really like how it looked, and I think every time I use fine liner I'm like, wow, that looks really great, I really love it, but I never stick with it because for some reason it feels like kind of a cop-out for me, as if because I can't control a paintbrush to get nice even lines and line weights, that I always sort of default to fine liner. And maybe that's the case, but realistically I always end up liking my art a lot more when I do it this way, so maybe it would just be nice for my confidence to stick with it for a little while and just experiment a little bit with my style. However, there are a couple of things that do impact whether or not I'm able to use fine liner, and those will become apparent a little bit later on. I'll point them out when I'm painting. As we move into the watercolor section of this piece, I just wanted to point out, even though, I mean, you're watching this probably with your eyes, and you probably already noticed that I only did use a fine liner for the witch herself. And the reason that I did that rather than inking all of the leaves and the hibiscus flower as well is because I wanted to keep the witch or the character as the focus of the painting. And as I said before, I'm really not somebody who does backgrounds very often, so I don't have a whole arsenal of techniques that I can think to and fall back on when I want to incorporate them, and also drawing attention to the place that I want it to draw attention. So the first thing that I came up with was simply to only line the subject of the painting rather than her background, even though the background is important to the whole concept itself. So what I was hoping to kind of achieve is, you know, when you take a photo of somebody and they're standing in the foreground and they look all crisp and clean and the lines are sharp and in focus, but then the background is sort of blurred and in the background. That's sort of what I was hoping to achieve with this technique. I don't know if it's necessarily how everything turned out, and I think that the reason that I did it this way was, one, because, you know, I'm trying to do Inktober and I wanted to use fine liner in some capacity and I wanted it to have meaning and improve the piece. So I feel like I incorporated it for a purpose rather than just because it's Inktober I use a fine liner. So I hope that it did something to that effect, but realistically the reason that I ended up going with this specific idea rather than inking the whole piece is because I don't think I have a good enough grasp of values and contrast and saturation and colour theory so that I can draw the eye where I want the eye to go without using kind of, I guess, coping strategies. So anyway, my shortcomings aside, which I do plan to work on obviously, I then go on to work on her hair here, and I have a particular colour in mind, and I see it in quite a few different paintings, and people use this kind of like pinkish, purplish, cream tone to do hair, and I really love it, and so I tried to replicate that. And I think that this palette, I'm using the kuretake, gansai, tambi watercolours. Still don't know how to pronounce that. Anyway, I'm using those watercolours, and I think that this watercolour set is perfect for that hair colour that I was trying to achieve, because it has all these really creamy, light, lovely pigments that you don't normally see in a watercolour set, I don't think. But the downfall of that is that they have a kind of milky or cloudy consistency, and that tended to have kind of an impact on the fine liner below it. I did actually and ah at the beginning of this and wonder if maybe I should be putting the watercolour down before I do the fine liner, but in the end I ended up going with fine liner first because I don't know why, I just decided to do it that way. I think that lining a piece first kind of, it to an extent sort of takes away the ugly parts of the process. I feel like when you do your liner last, it sort of brings the piece together. When you do it first, it brings the piece together early, so you can kind of avoid the ugly stages to an extent. I think that that can sort of keep me motivated in some instances, because you don't have to push through the ugly stages and trust the process as much when you do fine liner first. And I'm also the kind of artist that way prefers sketches and line art to a finished piece, and I think that that's really just coming down to my own inexperience and the type of artist that I am, and I'm much more of a sketch artist. I only started watercolour about 2 years ago now, so I don't have as much experience with watercolour and painting and colour theory as I do with just sketching, because I've been doing that ever since I was a kid. It's always easy to find a grey lead. It's not so easy to drop however much money on watercolours. They're expensive a lot of the time and hard to come by. So when you're a kid, obviously you've got grey leads and pens and erasers, and that's what you use, so that's why I have more experience with those things, I guess. And maybe that was obvious and I just went on that whole tangent for no reason, but there you go. Anyway, I think I've been working on the skin for a little while now, and I do want to talk about that quite extensively. So basically I always wanted to do a deeper toned skin tone for this witch, because all the background was going to be light and pink, and yeah, I was trying to play with values, and also I just love deeper skin tones. I think they're really beautiful. And something about this palette as well is that I think they're student grade. So these watercolors are student grade, and that basically means that they are to an extent archival and have a certain level of light fastness. But in some cases they are a bit overly mixed, so there'll be more than one pigment that's being used in order to create the pigment that ends up in the final palette. And with watercolors, that does tend to muddy up a color or tend to take away the vividness or the brightness of it. And I feel like that's definitely the case with the brown in this palette. And I think that it's actually called dark umber or something like that. And so obviously I didn't want to just go in with a dark umber, because humans are never just one color. We have undertones. There are people with olive undertones, with yellow undertones, with red undertones. And I decided that I wanted to give this lady a red undertone. And so I did mix in some, I think that in the palette it's called Indian red. And so I mixed in some of that color even when I was doing the base wash of this color, but it just wasn't quite enough, and I was worried that she was coming off ashy, and I didn't want to make that mistake that I've seen other artists make, not have the research and not know that people are dimensional and have undertones to their skin. And I think the reason for that mistake being made is the artists making those mistakes are white, and a lot of the time we paint what we know, we paint using ourselves as references. And I think that there's been quite a few memes and challenges going around. It's like, this is the art, this is the artist, and a lot of the time people's art looks like themselves. So if you're a white artist, you need to make sure that you're doing the research and making the effort when you're painting a person of colour to make it realistic and make it look nice and not ashy and monotone. So I really did make an effort here, but in the end I do think that she still did turn out a little bit ashy, and I'm disappointed with that in myself, but also a little bit with these colours. When I laid the colours down, they would look a certain way and they would look quite nice, and I would think that I've picked the right colour and I've made the right mixing and I've done layers well, and then as they dried it would sort of leach the pigment out. And that's something that I'm noticing about these colours a little bit. But to the same effect, the hair, where it sort of overlays on the line art, when I laid it down it would come out all milky, and you would see the lightness of it overshadowing the dark pigment in the fine liner. But as it dried, it was like the fine liner would sort of shine through a bit. So I think that's a bit of a learning curve that I'm going through right now with these paints, and trying to decide how to best approach using them with other mediums, but also just how to best approach them in general, because they are very different when you put them down than when they dry. It was definitely something that occurred to me quite frequently over the course of this painting, which took a surprisingly long time. It's like you add a background and everything takes 10 hours longer. It's insane. Anyways, as you can see here, I'm going back in on the hair with a light, very watery wash of the dark pink that I used for the darker elements of the hibiscus flower. And so I wanted to use this colour because I thought that it tied in with the piece, but I also needed the hair to have more dimension and more shadow to it, but I didn't think that I could achieve that with the light colours that I had used originally. Usually with watercolour you can add layers and that sort of adds darkness to a piece, but because of the milkiness of the original pigment, it just didn't work out that way. So that's why I used that darker pink, and by diluting it a lot with water I was able to kind of take away how vivid and saturated it was so that it worked for shading. Moving on to her outfit, I struggled a bit with this bit as well, and the reason for that is because I think the rest of the piece I was like, oh, I know what colours I want for the skin tone, for the hair, and when you search hibiscus on Google they're a pink colour and then they go this really deep, beautiful rosy pink colour, and so I knew what I needed to do for those. Like, it was almost like they were preset. But when it came to her clothes, I was like, well, clothes can be any colour. And so I let myself be guided by the fact that I was hoping to achieve a lot of contrast in this piece. In the end, I don't think I managed to achieve it, but I was aiming for it. So I thought, well, everything else is light except for the character herself, so why don't I lean into those deep tones and create a very dark colour scheme for her clothing. But I didn't want it to just be black, because I feel like, while I said, you know, everything else was preordained, her outfit, I didn't want it to be preordained. I didn't want it to be stereotypical witchy, just straight up black. So instead I tried to mix some blue into it, and I wanted it to have like a bluish undertone because I like the way that it goes with pink, and I also think like navy works well as kind of a compromise. I also didn't think that black was necessarily like the best option when it came to this piece, because I wanted it to remain a little bit light and a little bit airy, and it kind of reminds me as if she's kind of like on a holiday. And when I look at this scene, I think, oh, it looks warm and lovely, and even though tea is like a hot drink, like maybe it's just the kind of weather where you can have a warm drink and not get overheated, but you can still wear nice summery clothes, which is also why I gave her something off the shoulder and a skirt. And I tried to make the cuff of the skirt look a little bit like a flower, because I don't know, as I was inking it and painting it, I just thought that looked kind of nice and that it might work. And I feel like this painting, more than any other that I've done in recent history, is very considered. Like, everything has a reason in this painting, and I did everything with a lot of purpose, and for some reason that made me really proud of it. I don't know, can't explain why. I added some colour to the leaves because I realised that the way that I painted in the background kind of made them fade into the background, and I didn't want them to fade too much because I do like the contrast and the different sort of elements that they bring to the piece. Like, got some in the foreground going in front of the character and in front of the hibiscus flower, and some in the background, and I guess I just wanted to sort of push that idea a little bit. For the final touches, I did go in with my Signo uni-ball gel pen in white, and I just added some highlights to the high points of her body, as if the sun was sort of glinting off of her skin and off of her hair. And then I just couldn't help myself. I had to add some metallic bits because hibiscus, on the little furry bits near the top of the stem, have little dabs of pollen, and I didn't think that I could achieve that with watercolor, so I decided I was going to make them gold instead. And I seriously considered adding other little elements of gold to the piece, but then I decided, you know what, no, leave it alone. So that was the end of the piece, but I did notice a lot of warping going on, so I decided to try and weigh down the piece, and this was the result of that first attempt. I left it for about 12 hours, and the second time I realised the warping was on the left specifically, so I weighed it down with the heavier weights on the left-hand side, and I left it for about 48 hours. And I noticed a difference. I thought that it did a decent job, but I don't know if you can, because I think maybe it's a little bit subtle, but that was the best I could get out of the warping. And this is the final piece. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video if you liked it. Please share it if you think it was worth sharing, and please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notifications if you're interested in being notified when I post uploads. Thank you so much for watching, and if you would like any input on the following pieces that go up for Inktober, please follow me on Instagram. It's in the link in the description down below, and I'll be posting polls so that you can help me to decide what I draw next. Bye pals!